My question kind of goes back to how you were talking about like capitalism and how it's like forcing its way kind of into governing, um, and how we can't really just abolish capitalism, and it's not an overnight kind of situation. What are your thoughts, opinions, ideas surrounding when corporations and governments like shake hands? So if we look at India and what happened with the Farmers Bill, that was a clear corporation and government shaking hands saying, hey, we're buddies now and we're going to work together, right? What do you do in a situation like that? It's because at the end of the day, in order to manage these corporations, in order to get the power back, we need to give the power to the people. But what happens when the people are completely disregarded, even by their own government?
Yeah, I mean, this is a fundamental problem that we are facing today, is the fact that we, the people, elect governments, and those governments don't represent our interests. They represent the interests of corporations, and they buy into the notion, and this is one of the central points of this new project, is that the way that corporations are presenting themselves as the good guys now have seduced governments into partnering with them and into seeing them as the kind of partners in government, with governments often being the junior partners. And, as I've always argued, just at a sort of philosophical level, the idea of corporations being partners with government is a very dangerous one. Yet it's one that you hear all the time in the business world and in the world of government. And why is it a dangerous one? Well, it's a dangerous one because it's fundamentally anti-democratic. Corporations, whatever else you might say about them, are not democratic institutions. And partnership involves and connotes equality. So the idea of corporations and governments being in partnership is suggesting that corporations and governments are equals in governing, which is a nightmare because that's giving away democracy. What is a non-democratic entity, in fact, an entity that fights against democratic controls, doing being an equal with democratic government? That is basically not in any logical way. Forget about philosophy, politics, ideology, values, just in a logical way. That can't be democratic. So then you have the problem of Modi in India and the agri companies. Modi is he's a neoliberal leader, like most leaders in the world today, including ones that are of the traditional parties, socialist parties of Europe and whatnot. There's just been a kind of encroachment of neoliberal ideas and a taken for granted notion that corporations are now, in fact, partners in governing. They exert incredible influence in that their investment decisions can make or break communities or countries because we become dependent on them. And so we've created this kind of perpetual motion machine whereby we are now so dependent, we've handed over so much authority, so much power, created such dependence on these companies that we create a logic where we need to kowtow to them. What do we do about that? The solution is that we have to wrest back government and make it do what it's supposed to do in a democracy. That's easy to say, and it's difficult to do. But that is what we do when we protest in the streets. That is what we do when, again, like Bernie Sanders or AOC or some of our own politicians in Canada, in the Green Party, the New Democratic Party, or mayors in various cities, including to some extent in Vancouver, that we try to recreate democracy. And people often say in a progressive kind of way, but I just say in a democratic way. I mean, all that progressive politicians are doing is saying the job of government is primarily, foremost, and only to do what is best for the people, all the people, which means some kind of redistribution to ensure social and economic equality, which means ensuring that the climate doesn't turn into an absolute hot mess, which means all of those things. That's not progressive. That's just democratic. But our democracy has been radically messed up by the influence of corporate money in elections, by the influence of corporate money in ideology, in propaganda, in public relations, by the influence of social media platforms in creating the fundamental channels of democracy now in Twitter and Facebook, and deciding what gets said and what doesn't. My film has been banned from promotion on Twitter, for example. We tried to promote our tweets because, as you know, the way that Twitter works is if you tweet something out, it only goes to 3 to 5% of your followers if it's not paid for. So you have to pay in order to get it to more of your followers, and you have to pay even more to get it to even more of them, and then you have to pay even more to get it to people who aren't your followers. So we wanted to promote this film, and Twitter refused us that promotion. So, so they got to say who could promote the message that we're promoting. And so you've got a really difficult situation that I think the only way to break through is through citizen activism. And we're seeing a lot of that citizen activism now. And one of the stories in the film is to trace the links between that citizen activism and people who actually take that message into large P politics, official politics. So we feature the mayor of Barcelona, who's this super progressive woman, and sort of just came out of nowhere. And we look at how there is this real hope in sort of a new brand of activist democratic politics, which combines with activism in the streets and activism in civil society. And that's where I see hope. And so the answer to what, the situation of the farmers in India is look at the incredible uprising that's happening by those farmers in India. People like Vandana Shiva, who are just, incredible spokespeople for what's happening. And so there's a lot of hope in that. It's an incredible, there we go. There's her book. But it's an incredible, there's so much courage and sacrifice. But I think that's where hope lies, is to understand that these corporations, the Modis, the Trumps, the whoever, are just, their power is very thin. It's based on stories that are mythic. And our job is to try to burst the bubbles of those myths, to try to show how thin and ridiculous those stories are. That's not easy work these days in the environment of falseness and weirdness and hate and vitriol and social media. But what can you do? You either fight or, you don't.
That kind of leads me into another question that kind of just popped into my head. So obviously, corporations, capitalism, colonialism, all very tied together. But how do we approach individuals who aren't even willing to look at corporations as a psychopath or acknowledge that, if they're working for these corporations or they're involved in them, people that are doing the 9 to 5, people that are sucked into the system, not even realizing that the system is taking advantage of them and it isn't benefiting them. How are we supposed to approach people like that? Like as obviously, there are people aware, there is a conscious awareness happening throughout the world. And like you said, Ana didn't even know where that, like, the idea of a corporation being a psychopath came from you, but it was there, and that is there. But what about the people that aren't? Because there are people out there that aren't in it, and they're still sucked into that 9 to 5, still working for Amazon, and they think that's a good job, that's a career, this is a lifestyle. How are we supposed to approach people like that?
I think what history shows is social change in the right direction, actually in the wrong direction too. But what it shows is that two things have to happen before things change. One is there have to be people out there fighting. There have to be the people who are convinced of the things that the others aren't convinced of, like that corporations are psychopaths, and that the world and that climate change is a problem, and that we shouldn't rely on corporations to solve climate change. They're the perpetrators. We shouldn't rely on them for the solution, on and on and on. Those people need to do everything they can to keep fighting for that message. And they need to not be discouraged by the fact that people don't roll over and immediately see the logic of it. Because ideology is not the same thing as ideas. You can have a compelling idea. You can have an idea that is absolutely true by any measure of truth, and it can still be overwhelmed by ideology. And we see that time and time again. And when I say ideology, I don't mean the way that that's usually used as, are you a liberal or are you a conservative? I mean ideology in the sense that, actually there's a great book by a critic, a literary critic named Terry Eagleton, and it's called Ideology. And what ideology is this interesting fusing of ideas and power, and where the ideas are rehearsed so often, and where they so much reflect people's actual material lives that they become taken for granted, that they become seen as essential, as necessary, as inevitable, and therefore as unchallengeable. And I think it's those ideological processes which actually Marx first really identified in a brilliant way. And a lot of the thinking, including Terry Eagleton's, is based on Marx's original thought, mainly in a book called The German Ideology, and also Antonio Gramsci's work on hegemony. A lot of these notions, they suggest it's not, you can't logically argue somebody out of an ideologically held belief. And so you need to hit the streets, you need to work in political realms, you need to work in civil society, you need to make films, you need to write books, you need to do podcasts, you need to do all of that. So that's the first thing. And that was a long explanation of it. The second thing that history shows is that people will start to hear the message when material circumstances support it. So when Amazon is obviously not being good to its employees, when people are obviously not able to make ends meet by having a job in an Amazon warehouse, where Amazon is treating people badly during the COVID pandemic in terms of their health and their risk and all of that, when the contradictions of capitalism start to come to the surface, when inequality just continues to spiral as it has been, when the environment, when you're sitting in Vancouver and you can't see to the end of your block because of the smoke created by forest fires, and all of a sudden it's like, wow, climate change is literally in my backyard, whereas before it was an abstraction. So what you see in history is that when these power regimes, like our current corporate one, continue to push their agenda to the point where the destructive impact of it can no longer be denied, not by anyone, because it's so obvious. And when you have that combining with the school children in the streets protesting against climate change, the anti-colonialist protests, the films, the podcasts, the books, the teachings, all of that, it's that sort of symbiosis that leads to social change. And I think we're really close to that. I think that the contradictions are being heightened, and that is exactly why corporations have started to run this social responsibility, sustainability line. They're trying to mask the contradictions, because those contradictions are now patent, whereas 40 years ago, they were latent. Capitalism has been stable when there's been a major social dimension to it, when there is unemployment insurance, when there are welfare benefits, when human rights are being protected, when corporations aren't allowed to just do anything for the sake of making money, when public education is available to everybody and healthcare. And those are the most stable moments for capitalism, when it actually tries to materially and substantively deal with the contradictions that it creates and create some balance between social good and the production of profit. That kind of welfare as capitalism developed exactly because unbridled capitalism led to a major depression in the 1930s. It was out of that we got, Roosevelt and others, Prime Minister Bennett in Canada, others, Tommy Douglas, one of the founders of the NDP, calling for a new kind of capitalism that really created more of a balance. That's what we had until about 1980. But in 1980, we had the beginning of the era of what's often called neoliberalism, where that sort of balanced approach becomes Reagan and Thatcher and all of these sort of politicians and business leaders start saying, enough of that. Now we want to just be able to make more profit and we don't want any constraints. We don't want to be regulated. We want to privatize everything again. So we want to go back to how it was before the 1930s. And that's what happened in 1980. And we're now 40 years down the road, and it's just been devastating to society and to the environment. So what causes me hope is that now that devastation is seen and people are responding. And I think the pandemic has kind of been a catalyst for bringing those contradictions even more to the fore. Who are we relying on? We're relying on governments to get us out of this mess. That's who we're relying on. And what is Joseph Biden doing in the United States? He's becoming like Bernie Sanders. I mean, not as much as I'd like, but he's definitely not being his old Joseph Biden self. He's moving to the left. And he's doing that because that's what's needed to address this crisis. And because corporations are clearly they just keep lining up for bailouts, for more profit, for whatever. They're clearly looking like, selfish. So the contradictions are just boiling to the surface. And I think the shift in US politics we're seeing is a reflection of that. I'm not about to sort of, celebrate and say everything's great now, but there's a shift. And I think the pandemic, plus just the heightening of the contradictions, plus all the activism, plus all of the attempts at persuasion, like this podcast, all of that is coming together. The BLM movements, the protests in the wake of George Floyd's brutal murder, all of it is going somewhere, I feel.
And people stopping working for a period of time, I think, has caused a massive shift. So people who were working, crappy bar jobs, or, I was working as a temp worker because I'm an actor, and I was working as a temp selling perfume, and I just could not go back to it. And I think that's a common story now. Is people
interesting
having just stopped and gone, what am I doing that for? It goes against who I am. It doesn't make me feel good. I don't get paid well. They don't treat me well. I'm allowed to drink water. So why am I doing it when I can earn money doing other things? But then it made me realize that for so long people get into these cycles because they're in these modes of survival, and there's an ideological system that surrounds them that they buy into, because ultimately there's a feeling like they have to, in a way. This is how the world works. When I speak to my parents about have these kinds of conversations with them or with other people of their generation back home, it always gets back to that statement, this is just how the world is.
Yeah.
Or, damned if they do, damned if they don't kind of thing when it comes to corporations doing good.
Yeah.
They say that, and it's just Yeah. There's I don't want to judge people for having jobs for Amazon, for being involved, for buying from Amazon, for kind of contributing to this, because we all are in a way. It's a weird cycle. And I wonder, how much do you think the economic system plays a part in this, and our system of our currency in terms of money versus, this whole Bitcoin situation that became a massive deal during the pandemic. Do you think that this will cause a shift at all?
I mean, there's some very interesting sort of questions around whether things like Bitcoin and things like this use of the sort of Reddit mob, pushing up the price of stocks that have been shorted and all that kind of stuff. I find that, I mean, Bitcoin for me is just an attempt to privatize currency. That's what Bitcoin is. Fundamentally, that's what it is. It's an attempt to create a currency that is outside the currencies that are created, the fiat currencies that are created by governments. By another name, that's privatization. And it's privatized. In
a way, isn't it already? In a way, but not. I mean, the Bank of Canada, for example, is part of the democratic structure of the Canadian state. Now, does that mean that they do a great job? Does that mean that they're not beholden to the private banks? Does that mean, all those things? No. What it means is that it was set up on the understanding that if you're going to have a democratic country, that the economy has to have a semblance of democracy too. And so you have things like control by the people, not only of politics, but also of currency. And so that is part of the deal. You give workers the right to form unions and bargain collectively. So you have democracy in the workplace. So the idea is that democracy means that the people have to have control of the fundamental levers of power and social relations, and currency is one of those. And Bitcoin basically is an attempt to take that out. So there's a whole kind of, it's so progressive and all of that. But it's part of this kind of misconceived notion that it's progressive to challenge government and the state. It's sort of the 60s notion of challenging the man, challenging the authority, and forgetting that actually the government and the state is the only place where we have democracy. And that doesn't mean it's working, but it means that the solution is not to privatize everything and put it in the hands of an algorithm, and especially one that uses so much energy that it poses a major climate change threat. You can go on, and that isn't regulated and that has no democratic accountability. And then the question is, so defenders say, well, that's fine because we're handing it over to an algorithm basically to run us. And then it's like, wait a minute, when did we say that democracy was about a machine making decisions? Isn't it an inherent part of our humanity? I mean, if you're going to get religious about it, aren't we supposed to be the ones who are made in God's image? I'm not religious, but from any angle you look at it, it's hard to see governance by algorithm and artificial intelligence and blockchain as anything close to what we as humanity should be aspiring towards in terms of governing ourselves. So I'm not a fan of Bitcoin, as you can probably tell. I found that really interesting.
Yeah. As far as acting goes, that's another of my job. My partner is an actor. And as you well know, Ana, there are no more auditions in the real world. So we do all our auditions with a camera, and I've become by default the person who shoots those, and I'm also the reader on those, and I'm not a good reader at all. So that's become I'm learning how to act. So just by necessity.
Oh, did you see, this is such a off topic, but you mentioning that, did you see on Twitter during the pandemic, I can't remember when it was, but it went viral, an actor's audition, and the director didn't realize that his audio wasn't on mute, or that the person had arrived in the room already.
Oh, that's hilarious.
And he said, he like started talking, oh, look at these poor people in their little apartments, just talking about his crappy little apartment.
Oh, I would love to, like, if you could send me to that.
So funny. Yeah, it's hilarious.
Brian has my email. I'd love to show that to Rebecca because yeah, it's pretty hard. Just yesterday she got a role, so she's happy.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah.
Cool.
And so I'm happy because obviously I'm not doing a horrible job as her reader.